Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time today to come to our webinar. This webinar is called The Future of Horticulture and Pollinators, How to Ensure Pollinator Health in Protected Cropping Systems. First off, I'd like to wish you a happy Pollinator Week. This week is all about celebrating Australia's diversity and our importance of pollinators for our environment, but also for horticulture especially. My name is Ashley Zamek and I'm from Hort Innovation Australia. I'm an R&D manager and I manage our pollination projects. I'd like to welcome today our two panel guests. We have Dr. Katja Hogendorn from the University of Adelaide and Dr. Lisa Evans from Plant and Food Research. Today, our webinar will be more of a Q&A style session, so feel free to shoot through your questions as they come to you. You should be able to do this at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be recording the webinar, so you can always share it with your networks later. So we will be covering a range of topics today, but I would like to introduce you to a project that we'd like to showcase. We recently won the Round 4 Rural R&D for Profit project from the Commonwealth, and we are in the middle of it actually. The project's called Novel Technologies and Practices for the Optimization of Pollination in Protected Cropping. So it fits really well with today. This project has a range of partners, and I'd like to acknowledge them on the screen. It's a big effort, and I'd like to celebrate that we're a year in so far. So without delay, I want to dive right in. So first off, welcome Katja and Lisa. Hope everything's okay.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
So when we talk about the term protected cropping, it's actually quite a far-ranging term. Can you please explain maybe what ones you're working in the project and how that looks?
So our team at PFR is working in hail netting covered crops in Queensland and also New Zealand. And our focus so far has been on apples and lychee, but next year we're going to expand into blueberries and polytunnels in New South Wales.
And at the University of Adelaide, we are mainly looking at orchard crops in the Adelaide Hills, and that includes mainly cherries and apples. For apples, we're looking at hail net and also bird net.
Right, so you mentioned netting, and that's quite a popular option in terms of protected cropping environments. And for apples, I know they prevent hail damage, sunburn, and even bird damage. But what are some of the issues that come with using netting?
Obviously, large benefits there are with regards to netting. I mean, you've got hail, you've got birds and sun, as you said, but there's also big water savings to be gained. And I've heard from growers that that can be up to 50%, which is very, very substantial, of course. So those nets pay themselves back that way. But according to beekeepers, those nets also affect hive health. But we don't know how much, we don't know why that is or what we can do about it. So what we're doing is quantifying the effect on hive health of keeping bees under net in orchard crops. And we have seen that visitation and set is down by 30% to 70% compared to open pollination. So that's not only in the interest of the beekeepers, but also of the growers to investigate that. And so we want to know why and whether we're looking at heights above canopy, area covered, can the bees forage outside, and a number of other things.
Cool. Another thing we know that can affect honeybees under hail netting covers is the density of the thread weave and perhaps also the colour of the hail netting. So as you probably know, honeybees use the sun and the polarized light in the sky in order to navigate to and from their colony. So similar to the way that we use a compass. So any kind of cover is likely to affect how well they do that to some extent, but we know that the more densely woven hail netting can significantly affect their ability to orientate themselves. Another thing that may be problematic is the light penetrating through the covers. The dark netting, it may cause bee activity to be lower. So you may see fewer bees on flowers at certain times during the day. There's an awful lot of different types of netting being used. So the team's working really hard under this rural research and development program to try and figure out what attributes of netting are affecting the honeybees.
So another popular option I know are tunnels, maybe for blueberries. Do these present the same challenges as netting?
Yeah, they do, or even different, because of course the effects are dependent on the type of cover, but also, as they found in the University of New England, on the length of the tunnel. So they found really big differences in the set on the sides of the tunnel, and then it went down in the middle. And we are also now looking at, in actual fact, tomorrow, my crew will finalize collecting the data to see how that works in apple, whether we find the same thing, and that's very likely. And that is really important information because it can lead to management outcomes for the nets.
Cool. So these differences in fruit set that you see on the edge versus the middle, that's likely to be linked to honeybee activity, which again could be due to microclimate and light differences over the length of the tunnel. This is again work coming from Romina Radar's group, some really interesting stuff, and we're hoping to build on that next year with UNE and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and not just look at honeybee activity at different locations along tunnels, but also see what the flowers themselves are doing. So the nectar and pollen production, how much is being produced and the quality of it.
So something that happens a lot in agriculture are large monocultures that lack diversity. And we know that causes issue in terms of pollination diversity. Is this further exacerbated by protected cropping systems?
Yeah, sure. If you look at, we've collected pollen from hives during apple flowering while the bees were foraging outside. And when you see the variety of things that are collected and identify them, what you notice is, well, during apple flowering, the bees collect 50% apple pollen about, but 50% other pollen. And that wasn't surprising for us. The point is, just like us, bees need a varied diet. And when they come off almonds, they already come off a single-sided diet in the same family. And if they then go under net in almonds, they would have, if they cannot get out, again, a one-sided diet. And that one-sided diet may give them a knock. We also know that if the diet, if what is available plant-wise isn't attractive enough for them, the bees sort of shut up shop. They don't want to go anymore. They're not active. So providing them the opportunity to forage outside might be one of the solutions to keep them active on the net. But we don't know that yet. We have to investigate that, and we are. But we do know that good food stimulates bee activity on crops. And again, that doesn't only hold for honeybees, it also holds for all other crop pollinating insects.
Yeah, so as Katia said, this definitely further impacts the problem protected cropping systems, because they are either full or partial barriers inherently. So pollinators within the crop are severely limited to what they can forage on. And as Katia said, they require a variety of pollen sources, but also a source of water. And all of this takes a bit more consideration when you're working in covered environments. So again, as Katia said, the options are to give them access to the outside, or you make sure that they've got all the resources they need within the covered system.
So because European honeybees are our largest managed pollinators, and we usually rely on them a lot, are they still going to be important in protected cropping systems? What are the limitations for how they're going to work?
Yeah, so as we've mentioned already, they are known to have difficulties navigating, orientating under netting. Resource limitation is another problem, and pesticide exposure can be an issue as well. A big part of the RIDP program and work that's happening in New Zealand is to better understand how honeybees are affected and coming up with ways of mitigating these effects so that they can still be used effectively under covered systems. And we're making progress. So yes, I definitely still think there is a future for honeybees in many covered systems, and for the systems that maybe too problematic. So glass houses are a good example. There are other options being developed within the current program.
Yeah, honeybees can be really problematic in glass houses, can't they? They can become aggressive. It's problematic for the workers in the glass house. They have to be replaced often, and they're often inactive either because it's dark for them in a glass house or because there's just not the food around. And that replacement is very expensive as well. Luckily, well, insects are on average what the animals in the world are. There was 80% of all animals are insects, and very many of them visit crops. And we haven't really, as humans in the world, tapped into that very well. What you see here is a graph of the percentage of visits by different animals, and the dark blue are honeybees, the light blue are native bees, and then you've got all kinds of other insects visiting crop flowers, a range of crop flowers, and also being effective pollinators of them. So we could use probably in many occasions several species of flies in greenhouses. That would be an option. Native bees are used overseas in tomato greenhouses. We here in Australia use humans. They can also pollinate, but you have to give them special equipment like a pollination wand. And then there is research around the world with drone pollination. And we, in our group, the group of the University of Tasmania, is looking at harvesting and storing pollen for this application, because before you can apply it with a drone, of course, you have to have it and be able to keep it. So that's what they're doing. So we're not tackling this from one side. We're a bit all round. Ooh.
Apologies for the internet disruption. Just when you need it the most. So when we talk about the issues that occur under protected cropping, are there any solutions? Like, what do we do now that we know there are issues? And particularly in this project, will you be able to solve any of those questions?
Yeah, we're working on it. We're looking at evidence-based solutions. So we know that there are several growers out there that put beacons for honeybees on, or open nets, or make hives smaller, or put them under the crop far in the netting, or put them so that they can go outside. And all of that is not based on scientific evidence. So what we're doing in South Australia is we're looking at, well, how do we manage the pollinizers? Because that's in apple a big thing. We don't even understand how pollen flows through an apple orchard and where it comes from. And we also don't know what is the best pollinizer for certain varieties of apples, really. So we have Scott Groom, who is looking at how close do pollinizers need to be to the variety that you want to pollinate. And he's doing that by looking at the DNA of the fathers of apple seeds. So he's assessing, well, look, little apple seed, who's your daddy? And then he decides, well, where does that pollen then come from? And that means that we understand how we can best plant our orchard, and therefore how we can make best use of our bees, because that's the most important thing. And then Jay Iwasaki, part of his brief is looking at the feasibility of mobile pollinizer units. And you see him sitting on a truck here, looking at, with a truck with pollinizers on the back, looking at, well, how many bees will fly from, if I do this in this configuration, will fly from my pollinizer to the crop, and therefore achieve pollination. And the flags you see there are successful bee movements. Then they have to translate in pollination, which Scott will assess. And then we are looking at, well, what are the effects of allowing bees to forage outside, and what are the edge effects, and what does it matter if you open part of your rows, which you can do when you have rice net, as they called, which is fairly finely woven hail net that is closed with bungees on top. So you can open every other row, and we can look at whether the set is better on those rows. And that is what we're doing at the moment. We're doing a number of other things, but that is what we're looking at to improve how we use bees and how we manage the nets and how we plant the crop. Those are management options.
Cool. So as well as managing the crop itself and the netting, we can also do things to change how we use honeybee colonies. And I'm just going to share with you some results from hail netting covered kiwi fruit in New Zealand. We've recently just finished I think it was a 4-year research program, and some interesting findings came out of that. And one consistent finding that we had got time and time again across our trials was that smaller colonies fared better under the netting. So we recommend using, in covered kiwi fruit, more small or medium colonies, so less than 6 frames for a small colony, or between 7 and 10 for a medium-sized colony, instead of the large pollination units that would normally be recommended for crop pollination outdoors. So this is a figure on the, oops, sorry, just missed it. That was a figure of initial colony size and percentage change. And it actually works out that I think it was a loss of 4% more frames with every additional frame of bees in the colony. Another thing that we found, which is not all that surprising, is that if you limit the time the bees spend under the netting, that is better. So we know that hives decline quite rapidly, so you'll experience a high loss of bees the day after you put them in, but this does continue over time. Not the same rate, but I think 2% with every additional day under cover. So if there's an option for rotating colonies out of the covered block during flowering, halfway perhaps, and this can be to a drop site within the orchard, then that's another technique that can be used to prevent colony decline. Another thing that we found that was really helpful was providing water, not just within the covered environments, but out from underneath the canopy. So bees for certain need water to remain healthy, and it's possible that they have difficulty locating it in these covered environments. So kiwi fruit growers do typically provide water, but historically it's been positioned underneath the canopy, and the graph you'll see on your screen, when the buckets were put out in the open with mesh in them so that the bees can dive in, have a drink, and then escape again, you'll see that the numbers were much higher when the buckets were located outside of the canopy. And this may be something to do with the light reflecting off the surface of the water, and perhaps it's just easier for them to locate. Another thing that is likely to be important is the location of the hives, and this is something that we're currently looking at in apples. And this work will be ongoing, I think, with all the different crops that we are working with under the current program.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll answer some questions that have come up through the conversation. So the first question is, how can growers encourage alternative pollinators to support the work of honeybees? So maybe Katja, you can start.
How can growers support pollinators?
Yeah.
So, well, I'm a native bee specialist. So when it comes to the pollinators, that the bees that pollinate apple, they are present before apple flowers and after apple flowers. And depending on the species, they need food on every single beautiful day, like the reed bees that you see on the apple flowers. They have adults year round, and they will forage on every day. They are very abundant in Victoria and in Tasmania. So there are stingless bees in New South Wales and Queensland on the flowers. They need food on every nice day. And so apple flowers relatively short. And that is, then they will come to the apples. But if you want more of them, you will have to supply food for those bees at times that the apples are not in flower. And that means planting hedgerows or planting food within your interrow, or the simplest way is probably alternate mowing, where you let your interrow flower and then mow it, but not mow the other row, so that you always have something flowering within your crop. Those bees generally don't go very far outside of the crop, so it's got to be quite close by, like 100 to 150 meters. And a variety of plants is good, because like the honeybees, those bees that you benefit from that pollinate the apples are generalists. Look, apples is an introduced species in Australia and will only be visited by bees that haven't adapted, that are not linked to Australian native plants. That doesn't mean to say that Australian native plants don't help them and aren't food for them. So if you want to do something for your apple pollinators and all the native bees out there, then you plant good native vegetation. And in another project, we are formulating advice about this, and that is nearly available.
All right, I might move on to another question. So Katja, you did mention augmented pollination. Could you briefly just describe what that would look like? And are you going to use a liquid carrier or a dry pollen, which is very specific?
That's very specific. I don't know enough about it, as it's not something I have been working on. I know that apple pollen is quite sensitive, apparently much more sensitive than almond pollen, because I maltreated my apple pollen this year following rules for the almond pollen, and my pollination experiment failed, so or partly failed, let's say that. And so it can be really tricky to keep pollen alive, but it can be even more tricky to collect it, because bees have developed such tricky applications to really collect that pollen. I mean, and the plants too. In many cases, the plant senses vibration from the bee and then allocates the electricity inside the plant so that there is more of a tension between the bee and the plant, and pollen jumps easier to the bee. Now that is amazing. Maybe we can use these kind of things to harvest pollen better, I don't know. But I'm not sure whether they are looking at a liquid application or a dry application, really. I wasn't. Are you aware, Ashley? Are they looking at application at all?
There are definitely technologies overseas that are looking at application.
I know. Yeah.
It'll be really interesting when that comes to Australia.
Yeah.
Maybe a question for Lisa. We know bees are moved around during pollination time. Is it just a case of bees just needing more time to orientate themselves under net, or they're just never going to be happy, or they have to be under there for a long period of time?
Sure, there is some learning happening. I mean, there's bees foraging still, there's still bees in the colony when they come out, and so bees can learn to cope with their environment, definitely. And something that I know has been done overseas is that hives are moved in during the daytime instead of the nighttime, so you lose all your experienced foragers. They're the ones that are likely to have difficulty when you first put the colony in, because they're in a completely new environment and may have difficulty sort of figuring out where they are in relation to the hive. So there is some learning, but that doesn't seem to be the only problem. As I mentioned, hives do continue to decline while they're under covers.
So something that we're not really looking at in the project, but it's probably in the forefront of our minds, are the recent bushfires. Have we noticed a really big drop-off of pollinators, and especially in these protected cropping environments? Does that even present a bigger issue when there's even less around?
Yes, there are so many issues there. The bushfires have had a major impact on the food presence for bees, and that is one of the major issues. And it's not just honeybees, it is all bees and native insects. There were stories when the bushfires just happened that bees were completely attracted to the high-vis vests, or all insects were attracted to high-vis vests because they were so desperate for food. That is still an issue in the landscape, and it can. I'm not sure what the effects will be. I know that hives have become more expensive as a result of it, and that is not surprising. The cost of pollination is quite high, but honeybee industry gets their money also from honey, and if they cannot get that honey but need to maintain the hive's pollination, the cost for pollination goes up.
Any last comments there you want to make, Lisa?
No, I mean, that's a similar situation to when Varroa came to New Zealand. We got to the other side of it, we can manage Varroa, but initially there was definitely an increase in hive prices and a shortage, which is, a big part of our work is trying to manage colonies more efficiently so that growers don't run into trouble. But yeah.
Well, that's all we have time for. We had quite a short, sharp webinar today. What you will see come on your screens now is a poll, and we'd really appreciate if you fill that out. But thank you to our speakers, Lisa and Katja, and thank you all for listening as well. We really appreciate it. We'll upload this webinar to our website, and we'll also answer any questions we didn't quite get to. You can also shoot through questions if you think of them later. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of the pollinator week.